talk about the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia, or should I say between NATO and Russia, and really share with you how I came about to change my view upon it pretty much completely the other way around. I gained a new perspective, which I believe is truthful to what is happening. It gives you the truth behind the scenes, something that you don't see in the media, something you don't see anyone really expose. Let's start from the beginning. What I used to believe, just like most of the people, I used to believe that Putin is trying to take over these countries, or at least have control over them, Moldova, Ukraine, and a number of others, former Soviet Union republics. Now, my question was always why? And the response that you get is like, well, because he's a dictator and a tyrant. And that kind of thing is never, I question that kind of thing. I don't just buy it. That is not satisfactory, but I looked at the Moldova and the Transnistria piece where they have some military base, and all the talks about removing it didn't lead anywhere. Then Ukraine, their relationship. The second thing is I looked at the Americans and the EU as the good guys. And that's also a very widespread belief. The Americans are the good guys. They are coming to help us towards our democratic paths, and how wonderful and how bad the Russians are, or the government at least. But still, the question why with Putin still remained in my mind. Is he really just a bad guy? Is that a good enough justification? So I wasn't clear about it, but nor did I have a very clear understanding of what is happening, the motives, the dynamics of it. I just didn't have a clear understanding, nor did I know where to get it from, because there are all kinds of sources and information out there. But is it all truth? It's often just a perspective. Sometimes some of these stories are like pure, almost like fiction, the way they just take pieces and put them together. And then with media, media is so biased. It's amazing. Here it's very, very politicized. And listening to one party will never give you the whole picture. And when it comes to Russia, even more. Then what happened is Crimea happened. It just was like, poof, the next thing, it's Russians. Now, I don't even follow very closely what's happening. So this came kind of out of the blue for me, I don't know what happened there behind the scenes. And of course, everybody says it's been annexed by Russia. My thoughts were, there. Putin just is showing his true colors. Now we see he's really after, taking parts of these countries and taking these countries and to be part of Russia again. This is just terrible, these are my thoughts. And funny enough, though, I've been talking to a UK friend, and when I shared that, she said, well, there was a referendum there, people decided, so I guess people have the right to decide. And, it didn't land well with me. I thought, but didn't land well because, well, technically that's true. And that sort of disproved the theory that Putin is such a bad guy, because indeed that there was a referendum, and indeed it was voted with a great majority, 90-something% to join Russia. So the same thing happened here in the UK, and UK came out of the EU as a result of a referendum, it's very fair to look at this that way. So yeah, makes sense. Now, here is what I believe now, especially when it comes to this conflict. If I were to look at the culprits in this conflict, everyone is pointing to Russia, and everyone in the West especially is making sure that everyone is pointing to Russia. The truth is, when you look on social media, though, you see there are many people that don't believe so. But I didn't take my information from the social media or just adopt a view. I will explain it in a moment, but at this point, here is what I believe. The main culprit in the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now is NATO, USA government. NATO/USA government. The second responsible is Mr. Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. And third, in my view, it's Russia. Now, it's very easy to see Russia because it's seen as the aggressor, the one that actually is taking the action. It can be filmed and put out there and everyone sees it. What everyone doesn't see is all the talks that are happening almost behind closed doors, but not quite. Well, they are behind closed doors. They are still put out there, and people can watch them, but they are not as sensational as what's happening now. So, nobody knows about it. So, what changed my mind, and why did I come to believe that NATO and the US government is the main culprit in this situation, that they are the ones that led to this situation in the Ukraine? Really, about 3 weeks ago, I came across a video. It just popped in the feed. I don't even know how. And the title was, "Why Ukraine is the West's Fault." And it was a lecture by John Mearsheimer, distinguished professor in political sciences with the University of Chicago. I kind of got it pulled in by the title. I thought, interesting. Let me see what is this about. Let me see, just curious, maybe this will shed some light upon it. And sure enough, he does such a fine and clear exposition of the events that I highly recommend it to everyone. Go and look it up, because I'm going to put a link below. So what did I learn from this video? That the deepest cause for the conflict in Ukraine is a blatant disregard on NATO's part for Russia's security concerns. After watching that video, I actually was shocked and surprised to hear all that I've learned. It really changed my view on things. But remember, that was before the conflict. So when this conflict broke, I was absolutely furious. I was furious not at Russia, but I was furious at NATO, because this could have been avoided. But the organization that declares itself as a peacekeeping and security ensuring basically has provoked this war. So, of course, I went in and did a very thorough look at all the details, heard some other views, went and checked them, whether they are true or not. And I've come to some conclusions. So let's go back a bit in history and see where is this NATO coming from. Because for me also, you hear NATO, but who's NATO and who the hell is? Well, for those who don't know, NATO was developed in 1949. Basically, it's a military alliance between two North American states and countries here in Europe. In response to this, in 1955, Warsaw Pact was formed, which it was an alliance similar, the counterpart to NATO, between all the Soviet communist countries. Now, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact also dissolved. So basically, NATO didn't have a counterpart anymore. They didn't have an enemy per se to fight against. So technically, there is a view that they should have dissolved it well, but they didn't. Instead, NATO decided they are going to expand their activities now to include, just some other missions and humanitarian missions. And I mean, it's all there in the founding act and in their documents. What happened between, all these countries, Russia and a number of countries from the Soviet Union joined NATO. With Russia, they also developed a very good partnership, like the partnership of peace that they also extended to other countries. Now, I have something from the founding act signed or established in 1997 between NATO and Russia. NATO and Russia do not consider each other as adversaries. They share the goal of overcoming the vestiges of earlier confrontation and competition and strengthening mutual trust and cooperation. So basically, what happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the West and the East, the Soviet bloc, had a chance to restart their relationships And you know, everyone was tired of the Cold War and what it created, this tension that it created in the world. So the end of it was very much welcomed by normal, regular people. And it was a beautiful chance to start anew. This is where everyone was going, and this is where Russia was going. And this document, the Founding Act, it's very well written in that regard, and it seems like to be very warm and looking for that kind of relationship. NATO and Russia starts from the premise that the shared objective of strengthening security and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area for the benefit of all countries requires a response to new risks and challenges such as aggressive nationalism, proliferation of nuclear and biological and chemical weapons, terrorism, persistent abuse of human rights, of the rights of persons belonging to national minorities, and unresolved territorial disputes, which pose a threat to common peace, prosperity, and stability. So they had this good start. Now, what happened in the process is NATO kept expanding very much towards Russia. Now remember, this is a military alliance, so there were big question marks in Putin's mind, and he brought them up before summits and meetings, and just like, what is this about? So in 2007, there is an iconic speech that you can find on the internet where he addresses this Munich Council, and he basically says, guys, who are you expanding against, or who are you defending against? Who's your enemy? Good question. Who is your enemy? And why moving towards Russia? Now, you could argue that, like, Russia shouldn't be concerned. Yeah, like it's not a big deal, you know, it's just all for mutual collaboration. But Russia was concerned, and for good reasons. I mean, you're moving basically military bases around it, and yeah, why is that? And then when Russia put forth this request, it wasn't really taking very seriously. Nobody really considered it very much. And there is a view that like there was an agreement that NATO would not expand 1 inch. I looked into that, and basically, while some say that there is written documents about it, it was never a formal agreement. Maybe there was some discussions, but I could not find much information around it. I was looking in Wikipedia and then looking at different cited in material. Curiously enough, a piece where Gorbachev, who was the initiator of this change in the relationship between the West and the East, he stated that there was some of these promises, but that document was deleted on the 7th of February 2022. So then the other one was saying later, Gorbachev was saying later that actually no, there was no discussion. Nobody thought to bring it up to the table. But he says the following though. He says, the decisions for the US and its ally to expand NATO into the East was decisively made in 1993. I call this a big mistake from the very beginning. It was definitely a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made to us in 1990. So what is with this? Russia is raising concerns after concerns about the expansion of NATO. And the people are kind of not, it's not just him, just people are generally worried about it in the country. A June 2016 poll found that 68% of Russians think that deploying NATO troops in the Baltic states and Poland is a threat to Russia, while an average of 31% across the NATO countries identified Russia as a major threat. So there is a difference in how people in the West feel about Russia and how the Russians actually feel about NATO expansion. Here is one curious thing that John Mishmeyer brings up.
What's very interesting is that there is no evidence that we thought Putin was aggressive before the crisis. There's no evidence that we thought that. There's no evidence that we were talking about expanding NATO because we had to contain the Russians. Because again, NATO expansion was driven by 21st century men and women. They believed balance of power politics is dead. That's what happened here. Do you understand? Putin is a 19th century man. right? He does view the world in terms of balanced power politics, as do we when it comes to the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. But in this case, in the case of Europe, we were thinking like 21st century men and women. And we thought that we could just drive right up to his doorstep and it wouldn't matter, right? We did not think that Russia was aggressive. What happened here is that after the crisis broke out on February 22nd, we then decided that Russia was aggressive. We then decided that Russia was bent on creating a greater Russia.
What happened in 2014 that Russia basically annexed Crimea? Very simple. And again, this makes a lot of sense to me. Simply put, there was this Maidan revolution. People didn't agree with the result of the elections. They repeated them. That changed the vote. Unfortunately, as you probably know, there was lots of violence and deaths around that. And also, as a result, a pro-European leader was chosen, very anti-Russia. They repelled the minority language laws. And because of these groups that formed that were very hostile and aggressive and violent towards minorities, Russians in particular, this has been described as having fascist elements. Russians had a reason to be concerned, the people that were living there. What made Putin in my understanding, when he saw this change in the government, just coup d'etat, it was very clear that it would be very difficult for them to collaborate, especially on joining NATO, because they are very, very pro-nationalistic. Let's make a parenthesis. A lot of the territories that Ukraine have are very fresh in on the Ukraine's map. As less than 100 years ago, during the 1940-1954, Crimea was part of Russia before that. So because it was on a lease agreement, as I understand, and they have a military base there, they quickly annexed it because they weren't gonna let the U.S. Army establish itself there. So it was a clever move in some views.
We then decided that Russia was aggressive. We then decided that Russia was bent on creating a greater Russia.
But this is what happened then, and in 2014. That was the cause why Russia made this move. Also, I think, because there was no progress in their talks with NATO about this. NATO would not hear Russia's concern again. So again, I think NATO could have and should have taken a different course of action, given that this approach was threatening the security of this entire continent. And Washington, the leadership there, they obviously are not so concerned, because this doesn't affect them in such a direct manner. If anything, they do stand to gain from it, and I will go to the gains a bit later. Fast forward, and then what happened between then and now? Well, there was this situation with the Donbass region, pro-Russian, and that were very much disliked and marginalized by the government, by the current establishment. Nevertheless, as a result of those conflicts in 2014, there were these called Minsk agreements that were signed with the presence of Germany and France, Belarus and Russia, and also OSCE, and they agreed to a number of things which would have been kind of great in solving this conflict. However, the Ukrainian didn't follow through with that. And then there was a second Minsk agreement, and that wasn't brought to completion again. So there was this negotiating between the countries, but Ukraine failed to to follow through with that. The important thing for me was I wanted to look at what NATO states about its expansion policy. So I went on the website, found this document called Study on NATO Enlargement. I think it states it's from 1995. Here are some important excerpts from this document that are in contrast with the actions of NATO, threatening to bring upon us World War III. Article 13 states, it will be important to maintain active cooperative relationships with countries which do not join the alliance, in order to avoid divisions and uncertainties in Europe and to ensure broad, inclusive approaches to cooperative security. All right. I think so, NATO. I think so too. Article 27 says, NATO-Russia relations should reflect Russia's significance in European security and be based on reciprocity, mutual respect, and confidence. That's a very good point, and I don't see the mutual respect here. It's so hard to see when Russia puts forth these concerns and it's completely ignored. It's completely trampled upon. It's really hard to see how NATO is keeping to the principles that lay out about its enlargement and about not threatening the non-EU countries. Article 28. Russia has raised concerns with respect to the enlargement process of the alliance. The alliance is addressing these concerns in developing its wider relationships with Russia, and the alliance has made it clear that the enlargement process, including the associated military arrangements, will threaten no one and contribute to developing broad European security architecture and so on and so forth. Now, apparently, NATO's expansion is threatening Russia. Here's what it has to say about the nuclear forces. NATO should retain its existing nuclear capabilities along with its right to modify its nuclear posture as circumstances warrant. Yeah, and that also states it's a nuclear alliance, so I don't see why Russia shouldn't be concerned, honestly. NATO being a nuclear alliance, maintaining its right to change its nuclear policy, why that should not be a threat to Russia. But what led to today's escalation of events? What made the situation today so acute, and why now? I had that question. So this is my understanding about it. On 30th of November last year, 2021, Putin stated that an expansion of NATO's presence in Ukraine, especially the deployment of any long-range missiles capable of striking Russian cities or missiles defense systems similar to those in Romania and Poland, would be a red line issue for Russia. He made it very, very clear. And keep in mind that by then, US military forces were already in Ukraine training, supposedly, the local army. Putin asked US President Joe Biden for legal guarantees that NATO would not expand eastward or put weapon systems that threaten us in close vicinity to Russian territory. If back then, when Gorbachev, was involved in this dissolution and of the Soviet Union and NATO was creating these new agreements and understandings with Russia, if then nobody thought to put a legal guarantee in place for NATO in relation to expansion towards Russia, now Putin, just to make things clear, just requested that. Well, what was NATO's response to this? This is a very important piece. Here's what they responded. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg replied that it's only Ukraine and 30 NATO allies that decide when Ukraine is ready to join NATO. Russia has no veto, Russia has no say, and Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence to try to control their neighbors. Great. This is just in accordance with some principles that they have. This is in accordance with the freedom of every country to choose its path and to be sovereign. But this absolutely ignores the concerns of another country and other agreements that I read earlier that were stated about how the NATO is to treat and work out agreements with non-NATO countries and how to do that to avoid threatening the security of entire Europe. So Jens Stoltenberg, if you ever heard that guy, by the way, it's on a personal note, he reminds me of just some guy from a World War II movie, or some Nazi general. His responses, if you heard this press conference, first time I've heard it, it's like when you call a corporation about some issue that you have with your phone or with something, and they just kind of have a pre-written response of how to answer such requests, and they just give you the same response again and again. That's my impression about this, but that's just my impression now. Maybe someone has this wonderful impression of him. NATO took a machine-like approach, cold, heartless, careless, just, we're gonna do what is written, we're gonna give the right answer all the time, everyone has the right to join. I call this a machine, it's like an answering machine, you get the same answer. Well, that is gonna have great consequences for both of those countries and for the entire Europe. This is why I hold NATO responsible. And if a World War III develops, they stay condemned in my view. I don't know who's gonna condemn them and sanction them, because right now they are ruling the world. And it's just ridiculous, when US response towards Russia in order to prevent an invasion was what? Sanctions. Tougher sanctions. Here is Putin putting forth a concern for the security of his people, of his own country, and as a response, a preemptive response, in case he decides to defend himself, he gets sanctions. Can you take that in for a while? Why do I think this is wrong? Well, first of all, this is a very non-democratic response from a part of the world that considers itself to promote democracy. What is democracy? Everybody is free to decide for their own. Yeah, of course, yes. And then what is this freedom? You hear them talk about freedom comes with responsibility, right? Yes. So your freedom is not a freedom when it infringes on somebody else. In this case, there's this infringement on the safety of another country. How is that if your freedoms infringe on the safety of another person? How does it work? So NATO infringes on Russia's safety at the risk of a world war and at the risk of an entire Europe's security. How is that for peacekeeping? How is that for democracy? With NATO's actions, Europe and the whole Western world lost the chance to have a more positive and peaceful and flourishing relationship. I'm afraid this is leading back to the Cold War, because Russia lost a great deal of trust in this interaction. Now, how would Putin might have been impacted by this? This blatant disregard on the part of NATO, it gets to the heart of every Russian. It gets to the heart of every person, really. And look how long it took. It was even back in 1999 there was this observation. In 2004, a lot of countries joined NATO. And then in 2007, he finally kind of brought this up. I don't know if he brought it up before, maybe he did. And then nothing happened until 2014. Just NATO continued with their actions. The Cuban Missile Crisis was when Russia was going to take some missiles and assemble them in Cuba. And it didn't sit well with the US at all. They basically stopped the shipment and said, if you don't do this, we are just gonna bomb the country. We're gonna sink the ships. And then they made a deal. Kennedy had a choice at that time. He could have had a war or he could have negotiated. And thankfully he negotiated. I wish some of the current leaders would show the same wisdom and choices as Kennedy did.